Hello everyone and welcome once again to Radio Days with Gary Music Miller. I'm Dave Black. This is Gary Music Miller, the Hall of Famer for the West Virginia Broadcasting
Hall of
Fame. He is enshrined in this building we are in right now. This is the Museum of Radio and Technology. It is located at 1640 Florence Avenue in Huntington, West Virginia. Their website, you should check it out. Besides coming here and checking out everything else they have, go to their website, which is www.mrtwv.org. Check that out. It is a fantastic facility. It's everything you can think of for television and radio. I mean, there is literally every piece of equipment you can imagine. They have pictures. They have a section with all the pictures of the people that are inducted into the Hall of Fame, which is a regular occurrence, usually in October or something like that.
October.
And it's a fantastic facility. There will be a description down below that'll have the link to the museum and all that kind of good stuff. We also asked it if you like, share, subscribe, and ring the bell so you'll be notified of any upcoming installments that we will upload in the near future.
We plan on having some fun.
Well, yeah,
with the next several.
There's going to be one video of us just sitting here playing checkers.
That's right.
That's fun.
That's exactly right.
Okay. With that said, our topic today is something that we sat and talked about when we've talked about it several times. It's not just a one-time thing. We talked about, as impressionable youths, listening, having a little transistor radio under our pillow or somewhere that could not be seen by our parents, and listening to just tuning and listening to radio stations that we could just barely hear, or maybe that came in clear, and just want to find out where they are.
AM radio station.
AM radio, absolutely. Amplitude modulation. And
long really before many people were thinking about it.
Right, frequency modulation.
Yeah.
So, for those of you who are wondering. But I used to sit and have that thing, and I'd listen to Reds games a lot. And then when that was over, I would sit and until I fell asleep and would try to listen to see where I could find these things. And that was my part of it. Gary, it certainly has a different part.
On the other hand, my father had this big shortwave radio, and it had 10 or 11, 12 bands on it where we could listen to Havana, Cuba, or Quito, Ecuador, or whatever. We could listen to ship-to-shore things, but the bottom line was AM radio. And what I would do as a kid in the 60s and maybe into the early 70s when I started to work, I would start on the west side of the dial and start tuning. And when I hit a radio station, I would stay there until I found out where that radio station was. And, they would mention the station or a local business or somewhere, and I go, oh, I'm listening to Paintsville, Kentucky. And that was exciting to me back then. So I kept a little log of all the radio stations that I found. And then, of course, there was a vast difference between morning and night. For those of you that don't know, daytime radio stations, like the very first one I worked at, had to sign off at a certain time, because big time radio stations that had huge wattage, they occupied that same frequency. And if my AM 1470 was on the air past sundown, then it blocked whoever owned the big frequency of 1470, and bam, I would be gone. So, they would be gone, and I would be cited by the FCC for doing something illegally. So, but I would keep a record of the radio stations that I heard from on the AM, and that was just a hobby of mine. And as well, I also corresponded with many of the people, Radio Canada, Quito, Ecuador and stuff, and they would send out what was called a QSL card, which meant that you had written to them and they were acknowledging that you had done that. And I had a bulletin board full of QSL cards from other countries.
Wow.
So, but back to the subject of AM. AM radio certainly affected me and affected Dave in maybe a different way. One of the things that's most fascinating about me, I think, is that most people listen to the radio for the music, and I listened for the DJs. And that's part of how I became what I became. So, you have, Dave, listed some radio stations that stick out in your mind.
Yeah.
As
these are some of the call letters that I remember. Now, there's probably many more that I have just absolutely forgotten. But these are some that I remember that stuck in my mind because they are still around. They're still in business. They're still doing their thing, whatever format they have. I'm sure most of them have changed 1,000 times. But a lot of these I remember hearing, and what was fascinating to me was, man, how far away are these guys? To me, Indiana was like across the country.
Exactly.
At that age, when I was that age, as a young child.
Exactly. I'm thinking, my gosh, I'm listening to New York, I'm listening to Philadelphia, Boston,
right,
Chicago, and I can't believe that. And of course, that would only happen at night. Again, when the daytime station signed off, and you could very clearly hear what we called skip, AM radio stations that came in from these big cities.
And
they affected me in a different way than they affected you. They affected my wife. But you love radio as much as I do, so
but the skip access there that you're talking about, that is a signal that bounces off the ionosphere and back down to the Earth. Therefore, terrestrial radio is born from outer space, the first space radio, so to speak.
Yeah.
But that's how you pick up these signals that are so far away.
And those stations could not be heard during the day because. Basically because another radio station had that same frequency and it was on the air until it signed off. Yeah. And then you could hear, and there may be other reasons for that too.
But some of the stations that I listened to that I remember, and probably some of them Gary's listened to, and he probably knows them all as well as I do, and probably better. They're all these 50,000 watt flamethrowers. I mean, they are these absolute monsters of the airwaves. When you get into 50,000 watt range, you are an absolute titan of the airwaves. I mean, you can be heard.
Well, and I think didn't some of them have like 100,000 watts or something? I may be wrong.
I'm sure they did.
Key was when I worked at WKE, it was a 53,000 watt station, and of course, it stayed on the air all the time, so we owned 100.5, and there was a number, but there were other people broadcasting on 100.5 that I think had to probably sign off so that we could be heard.
Right.
So we're not one of the huge powerhouses. But
a lot of the AM stations, many AM stations across the country, are at 50,000 watts for some reason. Now there are some 100,000 watt monsters out there that just absolutely blow everybody out of the water. However, the great majority of them I have found through some research are 50,000 watt stations.
And I think there are probably some stations that rolled in here, especially when skip was prevalent, when the air conditions were right, that were only maybe 5 or 10,000 watt stations, but they rolled in because
they bounced off the ionosphere at the right angle.
Yeah, you're
exactly.
Ladies and gentlemen, Dave, the science guy.
Well, don't lump me in with Bill Nye. Don't lump me in with Bill Nye, please.
Okay.
Because he's much smarter.
But the stations.
But the stations I remember. The first is KDKA out of Pittsburgh. The only station I know of east of the Mississippi that's call letters start with K. Most of them west of the Mississippi are K. Most east are W. And it's one of the first radio stations in the country. So KDKA was in Pittsburgh, and I thought Pittsburgh was a million miles away at that time. So
I have to tell this little story in deference to my father. We had the shortwave radio on, and my mom and dad would have people in to play bridge. They would take me in and turn the radio on. I was 3 years old probably. And they would say, "What station are you listening to?" And I would say, "KDKA Pittsburgh, PISS." And they would get the hugest laugh out of that. You got to understand, this is probably 1958, 1959, 1960. But they loved me saying KDKA Pittsburgh. So that's a little story I got to throw in.
Your parents really had fun out of you, didn't they?
They did. They embarrassed me at a very early age.
Okay, all right. The second one I remember vividly, and it's still in existence, is WLW out of Cincinnati. They still do the Reds games and all that kind of stuff. I listened to them later on in life because I could pick them up, and if I happened to be near Cincinnati or in that area, I'd always try to tune them in and listen to them. There's a guy, and everybody that's ever been in the radio business literally knows the name Gary Burbank.
Absolutely.
Gary Burbank was one of the funniest human beings that God ever put on the face of God's green earth. This guy was hysterical. He did all these characters, and he retired several years ago. Matter of fact, I listened to his last show, and it was almost a tear-jerk fest, and he was just so funny. One character that I remember was a character named Gilbert Gnarly. And he sounded like he had a cold all the time. Dr. Gilbert Gnarly. And he called the White House in Washington, D.C., trying to sell them aluminum siding. One of the best bits I ever heard in my life. It was absolutely hysterical.
Incredible.
When he asked for the man that made the decisions in the household.
Yeah.
And but that just gives you an idea of how talented he was. But anyway, that's another one that's 150 miles away. That to me may as well have been 15,000 miles away.
Exactly.
Okay. Also, WLS in Chicago. There's 500 miles away. That might have been to me, in the solar system somewhere.
And boy, did WLS and WCFL in Chicago have an effect on me. I listened to them in the 60s, and then as we went into the 70s, I'm trying to remember, oh gosh, I remember a lady DJ by the name of Yvonne Daniels, who I believe was on WLS, and Fred Winston, a legend in Chicago, and he communicated with me via Twitter, and it was really, it was fascinating to hear from him. And there's a guy in Chicago, I think he bounced from CFL to WLS, whose name was Dick Biondi. Dick actually did a record called "On Top of a Spaghetti." It was a song about meatballs, I believe. I was fortunate. I went to Myrtle in the 1970s and found Dick Biondi working at a radio station in Myrtle Beach. And he invited everybody by one morning to have breakfast because somebody was serving sausage or something, and it was one of the sponsors. And I bet 700 people showed up.
Gee whiz.
But and I got a chance to meet Dick, and that to me was like meeting, I don't know, the biggest star in the world. And Biondi, last I heard, was still on the air in his 90s, but I think
wow.
he was huge in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s and 80s and on. And then I've often said, and I communicated with the guy, and he never wrote me back, but a guy named John Records Landecker did the night shift at WLS in Chicago. And he was everything I wanted to be. He was, it was like, it wasn't necessarily that I wanted to be that, but I thought to myself, if it's working there, it would work here. And he was very loud, very, you know, a fast talker, in-your-face kind of guy, you know, life of the party, very extroverted. And when I decided that radio was not going to be just a job for me, when I started at 16, but by the time I'm 19 or 20 and I'm still in radio, I realized that I needed to create a persona for myself. Excuse me, a persona for myself, and I didn't copy him. I refused to, you know, I didn't imitate him, but I let him inspire me. And so when I was on the radio at night at WKEE, many of you may remember those days, late 70s, early 80s, I had that same persona. I was the life of the party, you know, in your face, extrovert, you know, joking all the time. Just, you know, I had that personality. And it's part of what, I guess, initially, or whatever the word is I'm looking for, wound me up here in the Hall of Fame. It was just something that I did. And listening to him was a tremendous inspiration to me. And John, if you ever hear this, ever see this, thank you. His middle name, Records, was real. I needed to create a name. It's kind of a different story. I believe when I went to WCMI in Ashland, one of the people there wanted me to change my name. And one of the other people there didn't want me associated with, well, he wanted me to change my name because he didn't want me associated with the station that I was with. And the other guy didn't want me to change my name. So we changed my name, but didn't change my name. We added a name, and we added Gary Music Miller. And that's sort of an urban legend about how Gary Music Miller came about. But you know, when I would get down or depressed or something, I had a radio in another room, and I would go in and I'd listen to him do a break or two, and I'd go, yeah, I'm pumped up again. And I would go in and do the rest of my show and be pumped up. So, you know, I'd be remiss by not mentioning him. So.
It's great how the people can influence you, and you later on in life you kind of say, hey, wait a minute, that's what...
He did influence me, and he, you know, Gary Music Miller was a direct reflection of the kind of DJ that existed in the 60s, 70s. They, you know, they were loud.
Right.
They were forceful. You know, there was none of this, that was the Bee Gees,
yeah,
and jive talk, you know,
right.
it was always, that was the Bee Gees and jive talking, I'm Gary Music Miller. And that's what I made a living doing.
Well,
so,
Wolfman
you know.
Jack made a fortune out of it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So that was that. Okay, let's...
Well, sorry to stay on that.
Quite all right. Well, let's move ahead. Another one I remember hearing, and so did a lot of people up through many of the years, it was WSB out of Atlanta, home of the Grand Ole Opry.
Yep.
And if you had that on, and you had it on Saturday night, you were listening to the Grand Ole Opry, regardless. There was no other programming. This show was probably, arguably, the greatest radio show of all time. And it's still going today, I believe.
Yeah.
So even though I'm not what you can consider a country music fan, I still like some of the artists. But I can remember, you know, hearing the Opry coming across there, and I knew exactly what station I had tuned to by hearing that.
By hearing that.
Yeah, and so WSB is still a big name in the South, and it probably will remain that way for the rest of its existence.
Yeah.
So now that we got that out of the way, I've got some of these numbered. I can flip-flop some of them if I want to, and I'm going to do this one. WJR out of Detroit was one that I could pick up. Some people have heard of it, some people don't. I just remember the call letters. There was another station that I heard maybe once or twice, but couldn't really tune it in that well. And the call letters, this would be an absolute disaster for some radio announcers. The call letters are WWWW.
Yeah.
It went AM and it was on FM at one or two different times.
Yeah.
It may still be in existence. I don't know. My research was kind of fuzzy on that point. However, the way some people around here say W,
Well, that was it. I had to learn when I went, the first radio station was WWHY, and I had to learn to say W at the age of 16, say it properly. So,
well, I harken back to my dad's old friend Clinton Stevens.
double E.
When he was on, he did a radio show on Sunday mornings, Christian broadcasting on WWHY, and he always said EEEHY. It's like EEEEHY. But I always thought that was entertaining. This shows I need entertainment.
When you mention Detroit, the first thing that comes to my mind, and I don't know whether you could receive that station here or not, was CKLW. CKLW was a Canadian radio station that served Detroit. And so I mentioned a couple of Canadian acts that I really, really like. Someday we may do a show about some of the people that released records here that didn't work here but became hits in Canada. And I think any American sales of Canadian records would do to CKLW.
Right.
So.
But WJR I do remember.
WJR you remember, and I don't remember them, so
And
somehow I missed it.
But they've been around for a while.
Okay,
So
that's great.
last on my list before Gary gets turned over to some of his interesting things is the greatest call letters to me of any radio station in the world. Because at that point in time in my life, my young age, I thought it was the most entertaining thing I've ever heard.
Right.
It was WOWO in Fort Wayne, Indiana.
Yeah.
It's Whoa Whoa Radio, WOWO in Fort Wayne, and they just go on with this stuff, and it just fascinated me for some reason. Whoa Whoa. Whoa, whoa! Well, that was just
Why not?
kind of what you get out of it.
Especially when you're a kid, you're like, oh my God.
It's a great call letters for a radio station.
They really are.
You can't get any better than that.
Yeah.
But I do remember hearing them, and that was my that's my list. Gary, I'm sure, has some more things about a fella he may have had a little conversation with on a phone.
Not a whole lot. I mentioned WCFL as well as WLS, and they flip-flopped. I don't know who was number one and who was number two. I think they flip-flop back and forth, but they can both be heard very clearly here. And WCFL was the station that I heard Dick Biondi on.
You know, when you said, I'm sorry to bother you, but
oh no.
when you first said you started to say the guy's name, you said Dick Biondi. I thought you were going to say Dick the Bruiser.
Dick the
I'm
Bruiser.
sorry.
Wrestling fan, maybe? I don't know.
Old wrestling guy.
Okay.
But I thought he was going to say that Dick the Bruiser was a DJ. I didn't know that.
But WCFL and WLS created me, and they helped inspire me, and that's why I'm what I am. And I also listen to stations in Boston, New York, and WCAU in Philadelphia. I don't know whether you remember them or not.
I do not.
The stations that you mentioned, how many of them, other than WLS, played music? Did many?
Most of them.
Okay.
At that point in time, most of them. This was late 60s, mid to late 60s, early 70s.
I didn't know whether WLW was mostly sports or they played music or WSB. You know, I didn't know.
I'll just say the great majority of them.
Okay. Well, that was what I'd tune in, and I'd hear music, and I knew music would be followed by a DJ, and that's what I tuned in for.
Let me just interject one moment. That's back when these were being played. This. See it? Atco Records, Atlantic.
Yep. I played those in 1972.
These are almost a thing of the past. But I'm telling you something, analog music is not bad.
Well, I used to have to cue those up, and I did a WWHY, WCMI in Ashland, WAMX in Ashland, and I believe we were still playing discs at Key when we switched over to what was called carts, which was basically an 8-track that held one song. Yeah,
Back there's a couple of them back in that cart machine back there.
it was like a 5-minute long, and we would record. My job as music director was to transfer music from disc to cart. I will mention this just because it's a funny story, I guess. He gets a kick out of it. There was a station called WBZ in Boston. It was basically, as I recall, a talk radio station long before talk was in. And there was a guy who was legendary at night. His name was Larry Glick. And it was like trying to call Rush Limbaugh when he was around, or trying to call any of these guys that have big talk shows. You always get a busy signal. But when I called WBZ, I'm probably 13, 14 maybe. And I called WBZ and the phone rang. And Larry Glick picks it up. Says, "You're on the air, WBZ." And I said, "Hello, Larry." And I don't recall what I said, but it was about 5 seconds. And you could tell I was an underage, just a kid from wherever. And Larry's line to me was, "Grab a cookie and a glass of milk, kid, and go to sleep." And he hung up on me. And I was thrilled at that, thrilled at being able to actually hear Larry Glick on the other end of the line, because I listened to him quite frequently. And, get a glass of milk and a cookie and go to sleep, kid. Hung up. And it was funny. So, WBZ in Boston. I would be remiss, and we'll close out this segment by just mentioning the 2 AM stations that really got me going. WWHY 1470 AM. If you don't remember the station, bring your parents in, bring your grandparents in, whatever. That was my first AM radio station and my first commercial job. And then I moved in 1974 to WCMI in Ashland, and it was an AM radio station that played music. And it was, at a time when FM was beginning to come into its own. But WCMI, if any of you remember me on WCMI, I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear from any of you who have any pre-WKEE memories of me. It would mean the world to me for you to write me and, say, "I remember you before you were on Key." Because obviously I'm probably best known for the 31 years I spent on Key. But
No, it's not that long.
no, it's not that
Well,
long.
if you say it fast.
It's 8 radio lives, I think, just about. So, but that's all I have to add.
Did you want to touch on that email?
AM. Yes, very, thank you. Next time, I've got a very nice email from Sean. Sean McDowell used to work at Channel 13. You may remember him. He was a sports guy. And apparently a friend of mine, we were friends. He would come in and do the AM sports show that was on the air at the same time I was on the air, from 6 to 7 at night. And when I was on Key, he was on my sister's station. And he mentions missing seeing me and a guy named Russell T. Hill, who I've not brought up. Russell
The
T.
Thrill.
The Thrill, yeah. He followed me for many years. He went, I believe, from sports to news. I'm not sure. I'm not going to read this whole thing. But he says, "A topic for your consideration. Which artists from the 70s and 80s have you met in years gone by? It'd be fun to hear some stories about the celebrities from that era who were enjoyable to talk with." Sean, thank you for your email. And I do have stories. some enjoyable, some not so enjoyable. Those are probably just as interesting. But in a future broadcast, maybe next time, we will, I'll go over, if you want me to, a list of some of the people that I got to shake hands with, get pictures made with, and get to spend some time with that are now icons from the late, but mostly from the early 80s.
If that's all you have,
That's all I have for today. Thank you.
Okay.
I hope this has been fun.
we want to remind you that if you want to get a hold of Gary,
Yes.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to say there are actually 4 ways now to get a hold of me. Send an email to Radio Days with Gary Music Miller, abbreviated rdwgmm @gmail.com. I read all of those. I've gotten a few, and I thank you for writing. You can also get me on Twitter, @Gary Music Miller. Write me, or you can direct message me, and I will write you back. I don't live on my computer, but when I get to the computer and I read your input, I will respond to you. You can answer on YouTube. You can comment, I do believe now.
Right.
Comment on what you've just seen and what you'd like to see. And then also, a lot of people like to get hold of my wife, me through my wife's Facebook account. I don't do Facebook. She does. I mismentioned her name last time. It's Kim Miller, or Kim Farnsworth Miller. Farnsworth being her maiden name, so she could get a hold of people, you know, from the past. But it's not Kimberly. It's Kim Farnsworth Miller. Follow her, be friends with her, whatever the word is, on Facebook, and you can write to me through her. And so there's at least 4 ways to get hold of me.
We're not sure if her relatives were great inventors or not, but Farnsworth is her maiden name.
Philo Farnsworth,
Yes.
inventor of the television.
Yeah.
I wish we were related. We'd probably have a lot of money now. But thank you for joining us for episode 5. Please get in touch with me. Your input is what makes this work, and your input is extremely important, and I want to know what you, and Dave and I both want to know what you want us to talk about.
Remember to like, share, subscribe, click the little bell so you'll be notified of an uploaded program in the future. You won't miss it. You'll be able to get all the information there firsthand with that. So with that said, we'd like to thank you very much for watching. We hope you had a wonderful holiday season, and we'll see you next time.